This is another iROAR podcast.
And I think this sort of like expanding empirical world of listening with and through animals is to understand that the animal is not making a sound and I am making a sound, as we're all sounding together and we're sounding apart and we're sounding together. And much of the sound is just this continuous movement or this continuous flow.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn, everyone. This is season 4. We're focusing in on animals and sound. As you know, in the season so far, we've tended to focus on some method and methodology-orientated concepts, and we're going to continue that trend in today's episode with talking about bioacoustics. Mickey Vallee is going to join me today. He's an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies at Athabasca University in Alberta, where he also holds a Canada Research Chair in Community Identity and Digital Media. His work focuses on developing interdisciplinary sonic methodologies to develop new insights on human-animal relations. He has been working on a theory of critical bioacoustics, which grows out of his empirical research with bioacoustics researchers across Canada and the United States. We're going to be speaking a fair deal about that today in terms of how researchers relate to bioacoustics and how that alters and shifts the ways in which they understand the animals that they're working with. And I think that that's a really interesting way to go about it. We've spoken a lot about animals and how sound could help us to understand their lives. But an important part of this is also how, as a method, it means that researchers relate to the animals whom they're trying to understand. One of Mickey's big goals is to try and develop an ethical way of thinking about animals using sonic communication. And we're bouncing this around a lot throughout today's conversation. By the end of the episode, I think we're both pretty excited and energized about the potential of using sonic methodologies in understanding animals as well as understanding research. I want to say thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics for sponsoring this podcast, as well as to S4E3 Lab and the Sonic Arts Studio for sponsoring this season. If you are interested in sponsoring a season of The Animal Turn or have ideas on how one could be structured, feel free to reach out to me. All of the details are up on the website. Hannah Hunter joins us again at the end of the episode, giving us an animal highlight that focuses in on lemurs. It's a good episode. I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments. Hi, Mickey. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We were just actually chatting in the green room that we're both feeling a little bit, well, not both, actually, I'm projecting now onto you, that I'm feeling slightly slow today because I didn't sleep very well last night. And you were saying that that's okay because your household is used to late night interruptions.
Yes, no, brokenness and slowness are my normal now. Yeah.
Good. So hopefully we are on the same wavelength today, and everyone else who's listening is following us and enjoying the conversation. So we're on opposite sides of the world right now. I think you are. Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Calgary, Alberta. It's 8 a.m, and the sun is just coming up. Where are you?
I'm in Vienna, Austria, and it's 4 p.m., so it's nearing the end of the day. We've still got some sunshine, so we're not that deep into winter yet. But yeah, so it's wild. Time zones. I'm actually giving a presentation later this week to an audience in New Zealand, and I have to do it at 4 a.m., which is... So as great as these connections are, you do end up with strange sounds. So, Mickey, you are with us today because we're going to be speaking all about bioacoustics. And I know you've written a fair bit about bioacoustics. But before we get to the concept, let's learn a little bit about you. So what kind of work do you do and how does it relate to animals?
The animals I came to quite a roundabout sort of way. And because I came to animals about 5 years ago after working for a few years as assistant professor of sociology at the University of Lethbridge. And I'd done my doctoral dissertation and my work after that on philosophies of recording technology, mostly about how the sound recording technologies get folded into the aesthetic experience of sound. And with every kind of technological change, we have like a different kind of growing perception of the world through our sound recordings, and how, it was very much centered on like studio work, listening work, talking to people about listening, look at the history of listening. And after a small grant on Glenn Gould and his recording philosophies, especially with his radio documentaries, I was looking for something new. And what I mean by new is I needed to find something that was beyond this sort of human-centric confine. So how that became a point of interest to me, first of all, was was essentially, I think what happens in research sometimes is you end up writing the same paper over and over again, and to do that, you might have a perspective that you've carved out from years of research, but if you do that over and over again, then you're not really engaging in the joy of research, right? Which is your own self-discovery. But the second thing was this group of people in 2015, or it might have been 2014 or 2015 at a Brock University, who were hosting a conference called, I forget, I think it was Deleuze and Beyond or something like that. It was a conference on Gilles Deleuze. And the keynote was Rosi Braidotti, who was a post-humanist philosopher. Now, I had heard of post-humanism before, but I hadn't really, alongside other sort of concomitant field developments like new materialism, affect theory, and Anthropocene literature and such, and animal studies. But post-humanism I hadn't really explored before. And so I was exposed to it for the first time through a keynote lecture by Braidotti. And their programmatic, I thought, was a really refreshing one compared to other theoretical developments that were going on. And it was a principle of carrying on the work of the Enlightenment, essentially, but was shaking off the yoke of humanist and human-centered thinking. And they're really open to, as opposed to, let's say, like post-structuralist or postmodern movements, they're really open to scientific research and really open to cross-disciplinary collaboration. And they're really open to multiple standpoints and to expanding the field of sensation and expanding the field of sense, expanding data collection, and what it means to be social with others, other non-humans, right? I mean, sociology is, a discipline that's really enchained by, the question of human experience, right? The question of human civilization, the question of how humans make worlds together. The question of the animal is one that came up a few times, and it was one that persisted, but I didn't know, A, how to incorporate it into my work, or B, whether I could justify moving in that direction. But then, coincidentally, I met someone down the hall at University of Lethbridge. It's a small university. And he was a researcher in bioacoustics. And I didn't know what that was. And obviously it was biological organisms and their acoustic properties, right? Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about it to me is that they used all the technologies that I had been studying for years, or had been studying, sound recording. And the world of bioacoustics was a world in which people understand the constitution of organisms and through their communication systems. And the way that they understand it is by capturing it through microphones and recordings. And what they do with that was like this whole other world where the microphones are intended to pick up senses and sounds that were beyond human perception, but like roping them into human perception so that we can make them understandable for environmental change, for understanding evolution, for understanding human voice disorders and things like that. I went to, so I ended up meeting some people at the University of Alberta where they had a much bigger lab than they had at the University of Lethbridge. And I did not an immersive ethnography so much as sort of like on the ground observation about what they do in order to capture the sound of an animal. And that led into a bigger research program where I followed conservation biologists around through Waterton, which is a park in southern Alberta near where I live. And then I did some of my own bioacoustics research down in Crow's Nest Pass, which is a little corridor, wildlife corridor town where people living with animals is a very normal thing. So this world was opened up to me more through technology than it was through a direct interest in animals. But I mean, since then, the research program has built up into now sort of more creative explorations of using bioacoustics as a research method. So I don't know if I could offer much insight into the very complex world of bioacoustics from bioacoustics researcher necessarily, but I'm kind of more on the outskirts, exploring how it is that bioacoustics researchers work, what they do to gather data, and what that implies for their relationships with animals, and then the sets of assumptions that underlie their relationships with animals through technology as well. Yeah.
Well, I think those are exactly the types of conversations we need to be having. So I guess you're kind of doing you're doing like a meta analysis of your understanding the world of bioacoustics, not only practicing it, but understanding kind of, as you said, the underlying assumptions and thoughts related to using bioacoustics as a method. But I really love what you said there, kind of about the history of listening, and that was part of your project, and kind of how you had done a whole history of listening and considering what that entails, but that it had been, primarily human oriented or human focused. And then you were introduced to the world of post-humanism, which obviously entails a lot more than animals. You're also looking at technology. You're looking at, biomes. You're looking at things that stretch far beyond, humans, and also far beyond animals. So I think that's really, I mean, you could be talking about rocks, you could be talking about rivers. Post-humanism entails a wide array of organisms. So it's really fascinating how you've done this kind of journey from listening to post-humanism, and now with some kind of the entanglements of technology and animals coming through, which is really, really interesting. Could you tell me a little bit about that history of listening? What are some of the key things that you've kind of identified in your research and understanding listening as something we do?
Well, probably in the cultural area, the point to start is usually with you could start. There's so many places to start, but one of the points of interest that I have is with R. Murray Schafer, who's a Canadian composer who had passed on recently, and he was he was a soundscape composer, so taking sounds of nature and everyday life and technology and such, and then and in a sense, sort of making an ethics of listening to the world. And he had come up with this term called schizophonia, that was around the turn of the 20th century or so. And so it's at this point schizophonia, which is a splitting of sound from its source, where we became much more attuned to the singularity of sense in listening, right? And becoming attuned to disembodied voices, right? And you see this around the turn of the 20th century or so. Listening machines, or machines that we listen through, we start to relate to sound as a culture, relate to sound as something that is apart from a live experience. Now, I mean, that's problematic to say it's apart from a live experience, but it's, I think if there's any kind of dominant strain that typifies listening in the 20th century, it's probably this question of listening towards or straining towards, right? And it's captured in this, actually an animal image, which is the image of a little nipper looking into the cone of a phonograph. And you might recognize this from RCA Victor, from their or RCA. It's their long-standing image of a Jack Russell Terrier peering into the phonograph, the cone of a gramophone. And we know this image is called the image is called His Master's Voice. There was a painter, the painter who'd done this image in particular, noticed something peculiar about the dog that he inherited from his deceased brother. And he noticed that his brother's dog would peer into a recording machine, a phonograph machine, every time his brother would play a recording of his deceased brother's voice. And so the animal, the Jack Russell Terrier, would go over and look into the machine. My dog does this all the time with whistling in particular. I communicate with my dog through whistling. So anytime it's a puppy hears whistling on music or anything like that, she starts running around the house looking for me, right? So there's this very famous image of little Nipper peering, straining, and the particular gesture that the dog has is one of leaning the body towards. And I think if something kind of typifies the listening experience in the 20th century, especially through these sort of devices, it is a moving the body away from itself and towards this kind of virtual bodyscape, And all throughout the 20th century, we've been experimenting with new ways of becoming closer with the performance that only could have been made available by splitting sound from its source, right? And so, but there's an underlying assumption with that, which as if there is sort of a natural sound and source kind of natural coupling there in the first place, right? But at least what it marks, is a change in the listening habit, which is that straining towards that which is absent, right? It's a present absence. And I think that typifies a lot of the literature that's devoted to sound recording technologies throughout the 20th century, and trying to get like it's not like gazing at a photograph where you're looking at a representation of something. It's lifting off the energy of a sound source and being in the presence of the transduction of that energy, right? And so there's something like fully embodied yet absent of bodies at the same time. I think that would probably characterize to sum up the 20th century in a short statement. There'd probably be a way of summing it up. Yeah.
It's really interesting because, I remember the first time I saw someone talking what seemed to me to be in like midair. I was on a bus and someone was just talking, and I actually thought something was wrong until I realized that they were wearing headphones that I couldn't see, and they were speaking. They were leaning towards a sound that was disembodied from me, I guess, to some extent, or absent and invisible to me. And I remember that being a really jarring experience, seeing someone talking and hearing something that I wasn't privy to. So I guess it also creates all of these kind of different sonic spaces and sonic experiences, because that person was listening to someone else, and it subverted my reality in some ways. It changed my experience of how I was interacting with my environment at that time. But what I really like about your description there about the dog leaning towards the sound is this also said to me, and that expression saying his master's voice. There's a lot of multi-species stuff going on there, right? So you're speaking about someone who's doing sound analysis, who's working with the sound recording. This is a representation of an animal listening to a device, and then on top of that, you've got kind of the hierarchy between the human and the animal also being represented there, his master's voice, which isn't inherently necessarily bad. It's like you said, a dog would likely lean towards their person or their human. But it's really interesting to kind of think through these sound entanglements and whether the dog was listening to the person's voice or maybe picking up on a sound that, as you said earlier, was maybe perhaps imperceptible to the person doing the recording, which is fascinating. So is this coming to bioacoustics? I did in the first episode a conversation about soundscapes, which I understand is now kind of understanding the broader, almost connectivity of a whole bunch of different sounds, how sounds come to us at different levels and different scales. How is bioacoustics as a concept or an idea different to soundscape?
Well, it's a very much a field that is tied to conservationist and evolutionary biology, and so it's not. There are other kinds of acoustics that grew out of this, right? Which is, I think some of the latest movements, like when you were talking to your soundscape guests, for instance, you probably ran across terms like acoustic ecologies or ecoacoustics. And I mean, now the conservationist biologists understand, they always understand that an animal is not separate from its environment, right? But for lack of a better term, they used bioacoustics as a way of, sort of like framing, like early on when bioacoustics was first starting as like a field of study through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It was like as far as I understand, it was like a taxonomic system, right? It was a way, and they found that sound was an easier way of classifying and identifying birds than was seeing them. Because birds hide their bodies, right? But they display their voices, and they display their voices for all kinds of reasons, right? They display their voices in order to attract a mate, or they display their voices in order to deter a predator, or display their voices just to territorialize, right? But their voices are always on display. So they found that recording them once the technology was good enough to record their voices, was a much easier way to isolate and determine what was what organism. And that's the talk about the master, right? It's that masterful classification system that they have. But before that, I was looking for a source of this last night, though. But I couldn't quite find it through my computer records. But there's rumored to be these ornithology booklets of people classifying, before recording technology was popular, of people classifying birds, scientists, according to onomatopoeia. So that chickadees are, classified by their cheeseburger sound, or other nuthatches, and they're like the ornithology books from back then are like these little books of poetry with but they're at the same time, there's scientific classifications, and they're these wonderful wonderful booklets of of people coming to these really funny kind of sounds and these words that sound like the animals, but when you say them out loud, it's like, oh yes, that is connected to the
That's
sound
so
of the chickadee. It's easier to say it. It is, and apparently, and I read this, this passage, and I can't find it since, which makes me think maybe I made it up. But there was
I know that feeling.
Yeah, when you want your data outcomes to be what they are.
I think I've inserted myself into other people's memories before, like I was there. Anyway.
There's this wonderful passage of people describing researchers at conferences having heated debates over whether the sound of a nuthatch is a chika 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 or a chiku chiku chiku, and it's this image of scientists kind of mimicking these sounds. Is this wonderful? Like, it sounds like Professor Challenger in Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus turning into a lobster live on the spot. Is these scientists turning into animals in these rooms debating over what sound a chickadee made? Right.
I love
and so,
that
so
image.
And
it's a different kind of engagement with sound. It's what we kind of do now with just recording, and then that's somehow real. It was a different kind of embodiment of sound. Like, you had to actually emulate the animal's sound. How many of our dogs learn our language, and how many barks and growls do we learn of theirs? And here you've got scientists in a room trying to figure out the sound, which is just
the sound. The outside the door, like these. I mean, I imagine these places sounded quite, hilarious, right? I mean, and I love science from back, before paradigm shifts happen, before like when new methods take over because they're more effective. But these older methods, the more defunct they feel like. Or, I mean, back in right until up through the 1930s, they thought that starlings communicated by telekinetic powers. Was some right up into the 1930s. So it's interesting to see like how we think now. We wouldn't assume that, but not so long ago, it was the paradigm to think that there was some kind of psychic transference amongst animal bodies, and somehow the psychic transference manifested in the sounds that they made with one another. I mean, it's not far off. It is a vibrational milieu, right? Like if in sound studies, what is assumed anyway in sound studies is that sound moves the body through changes in air pressure, right? And so through these fluctuations in air pressure, you can, determine the movement of another starling, right? While they're flocking in those massive murmurations, right? But
those are so beautiful.
And you must see them out in Vienna. You must see them from time to time.
I haven't seen any big ones yet, but like murmurations of any. I know when I spoke to Jonathan Belcom about fish, we also spoke a bit about this, and just in terms of how, because you think of fish, they don't have ears, but they also use these vibrations, and they use their bodies to kind of keep their distance from other animals, and this is how they can do these massive shoals. And same thing with the murmurations. I love the idea. You're speaking here, people didn't necessarily have the same vocab as we have. They didn't scientize it. In some ways, it seems like animals have more agency. If you were talking of it being like some telekinetic way that the animals were communicating, whereas now we just like, oh, it's instinct, or oh, it's it's really fascinating.
Well, they talk about starling. They talk about it almost like an algorithm now. It's a rule. It's a set of rules that starlings follow, which is that they follow I think they've isolated the number as the number 7. They follow the 7 closest neighbors. And so it's a topological It's a topological relation. And so
Mm.
every bird is following its 7 closest neighbors and is followed by its 7 closest neighbors. But of course that expands out and out and out. And they all move in these movements to evade predators, right? But part of that movement is you can't find any bioacoustics research on starlings unless the bioacoustics researcher is looking at an individual starling. But the mass murmuration of starlings, like it's an old Zeno's paradox. It's like the sound of one starling is not the sound of a murmuration of starlings.
No.
That can only come about through this massive orchestration, right? And there's a disorienting kind of sound. It's a swoosh. It's a physical kind of feeling when they come up over you, right?
Incredible.
Although I shouldn't speak too boldly about my experience with starlings, because in Calgary they come in murmurations of like 10. So
Hey, 10
they can be another in the thousands.
Movements of 10 of anything are probably shifting some air and making some movement. So,
yes, it's still done.
Fair enough. But you brought in bioacoustics then. I think this is kind of speaking a bit to the focus of today. And so are bioacoustics a set of methods? Are they all, is it very particular types of methods, or is bioacoustics kind of a philosophy? So soundscape, I get, is almost a noun. It's a thing that you can like record, and you've got soundscape studies, so you want to understand all the elements. But are bioacoustics the methods that one would use in order to understand the sound of something? Or is there a broader kind of philosophy or idea behind bioacoustics?
The only, as far as I know, again, and this is still from an outsider perspective, the bioacoustics theoretical literature is devoted to evolution, adaptation, environment, mate selection, right? And so there's this sort of, and again, I don't want to practice in a critical bioacoustics and but I do want to talk about the limitations of that kind of paradigm of thinking according to the organism's evolutionary development in correspondence with other evolutions, right? But with the theoretical literature in bioacoustics research seems to be limited to that, because there's so much pragmatic work that's being done, and most of it is methodological. And so, if you have, there's people working at the, I think I forget what zoo it is. It's either Indiana or Indianapolis, I think. They work with orangutans and record the vocal grunts of orangutans, and find that deep within the vocal folds of orangutans that there's some human component there which is with their emotions, right? So, I mean, underlying all the words I'm saying are these intonations, the murmurations that the fetuses are exposed to in the mother's womb and such. And there's this sort of like interconnected soundscape between bodies in the world. And that's contained in the vocal folds of orangutans. And they do that by recording closely on a microphone the sounds that an orangutan makes every time it's offered a cookie. And they find, it makes the same sound, right? And so that's a really isolated experimental situation. And bioacoustics, another method, that's one method for studying bioacoustics. Another method is to do like field bioacoustics, right? And this was through field research I did with Waterton, where we would hike from post to post to post through the mountains. And there are these listening posts, and you sit down in your listening post and you'd have, I don't have the microphone on me, actually. Sorry, I was going to show you. You go from post to post to post, and you do a 10-minute recording. And everybody stays silent, and you kind of find your place. Like everyone's wearing backpacks and, Patagonia gear and stuff like that, which is loud when you walk, right? Yeah. So you have to stay perfectly still like a rock and press record for 10 minutes. And you just do this at different listening posts. And then when you take the recordings back, you have them all marked down about where those listening posts were. And they're all for recording a dawn chorus over the course of about an hour. And those recordings are sent to somebody who listens to them to identify species variations, right? Okay. And they do that by ear. And then there's another kind of bioacoustics. I'm just reaching behind my computer here to show you what other kinds of bioacoustics methods there are. And they use these devices called...
yes.
I'm not sure if you've seen these. They're called ARUs, automatic recording units, or automated recording units.
I think Brian showed us a similar thing. So these are the ones you attach to the tree, like a box.
You attach it to the tree. Exactly. And this is my favorite thing. I've taken this on many hikes because you can really, I do a lot of damage to my machines, and this actually made by, if you have an iPhone, the the OtterBox shell for an iPhone you can buy at Best Buy. This machine is made by OtterBox as well, and so there's all sorts of like industry connections with these machines. But these are they strap these to trees and they can record up to a year or possibly a couple of years, and they're cheap they're easy to maintain, they're cheap, and these were the ones that they use up at University of Alberta. And there they have boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of these machines. Mm-hmm. And it looks like, it almost, when you see these together, it looks like a murmuration of starlings. It's like that uncanniness of seeing something repeated so many times like that, like Pink Floyd's The Wall,
And then that data goes that data goes automatically.
That's automatically uploaded, and that's called computational bioacoustics. So the first one is like evolutionary bioacoustics would be listening to orangutans' vocal folds, right? Field bioacoustics would be like doing field recordings, like longitudinal bioacoustics would be doing field recordings at every post and then sending those recordings to somebody who physically listens to the recordings after to identify through their listening what animals are making sounds at this time of year. And these are listeners, professional listeners. That has this whole interesting aspect to itself, because in that case, there was the story being shared, and I haven't interviewed this guy yet, but how he identified that there was this, one of these listeners identified that there was a declining population of bird species, but it actually turns out that he was losing his hearing at that frequency where that bird species occupied. Yeah. So there was, so they had to backtrack and hire another listener, and they found out that species of bird wasn't, I haven't had that verified yet through an interview, but it was a story shared by a couple of people that work down at Waterton Parks.
But I mean, that's an interesting idea. Yeah. It inserts the researcher into the research, right? Because a lot of this starts to, like you said earlier, sound a bit disembodied. Even those three kind of types of bioacoustics. You said evolutionary bioacoustics, then what was the second one called now?
Field. I just called it field bioacoustics. You might have called it something else.
And then the one with big data is
computational
bioacoustics.
Because they go into a computer and then it analyzes it. Sorry.
And that's where you've got kind of really big data, and you've kind of got machines that are figuring out they've got algorithms and they're figuring out what they're listening to. But in a lot of these, as an animal study scholar, I'm listening to this and I've got to say, I'm starting to think like, where are the animals in here? It seems to be quite focused on sound and the collection of sound and the understanding of sound. And yes, it seems to be oriented towards conservation and preserving kind of environments, which of course animals are implicated in there. But increasingly I'm like, okay, where are the animals and their experiences? How can sound help us to understand animals? And the closest you came to that, I think, was the orangutan enjoying a cookie, where you say, okay, but then that's also kind of reductionist to some extent, where you're not really, you're trying to kind of create a sound situation. And I know like lab science has been critiqued somewhat for that. So how could sound studies or bioacoustics possibly be used to better grapple with the experiences of animals, of actually trying to understand whether they are conversing with one another or are having conversations or disagreements? Has this been done at all in bioacoustics, or is that a different kind of field or something?
I mean, the experiences is what I was after. I mean, of course, with the sound recording is where it was coming from. But what I was interested in, how does the sound recording change when those who are capturing the sound are engaging with animals? And and there's a lot of labor put into the production of nature. Like in the field recordings, we had to stay very still in order for the sound of our coats not to be picked up by the microphone and thus ruin the natural experience. Or you have to isolate a lot of variables in order to get the orangutan to grunt for a cookie to hear its natural sound. And I think the labor of the computational bioacoustics researchers, and I mean, not to classify them because they're also evolutionary bioacoustics researchers or conservation biologists, the labor that they put in up north in northern Alberta was really fascinating. And to talk about, for instance, one of the most in-depth areas that I looked at was research on nighthawks. And it's been a couple of years since I've done since I've joined the field researchers for nighthawks. But the nighthawk population they were looking at was just north of the Alberta bitumen sands. And so it's about, from Edmonton, that's about a 5-6 hour drive or so, like quite far up north, and then through the bitumen sands, which is quite a sight to see from within. The massiveness of it isn't quite captured in the Anthropocene documentaries and videos that we have of it. Being in it is really interesting. And then so you drive through the bitumen sands and you go up north on a dirt road using your Garmin and so that you don't get lost. There's no cell service up there or anything. And they're stationed in a trailer, essentially, and they live there for a couple of months in a trailer. And they go out every night, because nighthawks are, of course, night animals. And every night they go hunting for nighthawks, and nightjars is also what they call them. And so we go out, and you have to have a really good truck to get through that sand, because it sinks so deeply. And then when we got out to the field eventually, we had to be very quiet and start listening to them. And nighthawks don't have they're unusual for bioacoustics, I found. And what I found attractive about them was that they don't make a beautiful sound or anything like that you can mimic. They soar through the air, they dive, and as they dive, their wings make a whistling kind of sound. And then in between those dives, they're kind of like an explosion of air, like a little sonic boom. And they do it, I think, to disorient their prey, right? And that's what they kind of speculated anyway. But when they're hunting them, they're trying to capture them, right? They put up these giant mist nets, which were invented in the 1940s as like humane ways to capture the animal. And then in the mist nets, they put a little ghetto blaster, which is like a little, they call them ghetto blasters, right? A little sound speaker. And they place that inside the mist net, and the sound speaker plays out, does a playback methodology, where it plays out the sound of another nighthawk. And so the sound of a nighthawk is just a short peent kind of sound. It's nothing beautiful. It's nothing worth like listening to. It's not going to put you to sleep in your noise machine at night, right? But it lets out this peent sound that the machine makes. And then they put decoys all through the mist nets. And what they find is that the nighthawk will dive into the mist net. And that's how they capture the nighthawk. And what they do with it after that is they have like several researchers all talking on walkie-talkies, talking about, okay, I got 7 nighthawks here, I got 3 nighthawks there, let's go collect them. And I went with them, and you're tromping through the sands, holding out these little canvas bags to put the nighthawks in these canvas bags. And they take them out, and they're very gentle with them, right? As far as I could tell. And they would go back to the truck, and that would be their station where they would start to analyze them and wire them up. And what they were doing was they were putting little GPS tracking devices on them, and they were putting little sound recording units on them, very tiny little microphones on the nighthawk, so they could hear it making its sound as it was migrating and moving through space and time, right? And this was the experience of capturing the nighthawk. And there were these. What was interesting about it was, again, this isn't about the animal's experience, but it's about the researchers' experience with them, is through this sort of sonic collecting, they were able to individually name the animals according to the sounds that they made. So not only could you classify, this is what one of them was telling me, not only can you classify an animal according to its species, according to its sound, right? But you could classify particular animals to their particular sounds. Like people are identified by their voice prints. Now, my voice print is unique, like your voice print is unique. There's no one voice print, right? And so they attributed all these musicians' names to the nighthawks. There was Tom Waits, there was Gord Downie, and Gord Downie was very special, I think, because Gord Downie, I forget where Gord Downie was found, maybe at the end of a rainbow or something like that. Like it was a special one for the researchers themselves, but they developed these kind of intimate relationships with them based on their sounds and their sounding. I mean, all of this, of course, is to track the population of nighthawks, which are some of the oldest, I forget what they call it in evolutionary biology, but original design animals. Like the way the nighthawk looks today is probably what it looked like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And so they're these weird, it's like holding a toy when you're looking at them, it's like holding a toy from like the 1910s or something. Like there's something that's antiquated looking about them, but they're just like, they're such simple, perfect design. And that's how they got into, like, I'm not sure about I think with that became kind of a methodological point of interest for myself, because when I started doing this sort of second phase of bioacoustics research, which isn't critical bioacoustics, which would be like the study of the context under which nature is possible, but more rather the ethical relationships with animals that people have through their sounds. So some of the research I'm doing right now is on bear awareness and living with bears in Crow's Pass, as well as ethics of relating to animals through their voices. And so there is no animal's voice in this kind of research. There's a sort of like zone of intertwined entanglement between different animals' voices, because an animal doesn't voice because it has the capacity to do so. It's primarily relational. And that's something that's kind of missing from the bioacoustics theoretical literature. And so what I'm trying to do is not discount it. Of course not. There's so much gratitude I have for the people that showed me this world, but is to take their findings and use that as an opportunity for thinking about bioacoustics relationally instead.
Yeah.
So how people live ethically with animals on a daily basis, like with bears, they live to avoid the bears in order to not have an encounter, so that the bear becomes human savvy, so all the different techniques that people have. Yeah.
In my question earlier, it wasn't to kind of disavow the work of scientists going to these remote places. I mean, there's a lot of work being done, I think, in a lot of remote places by people generating and gathering knowledge and ideas that help research and that help conservation and that do a lot of great work. But as someone who's interested in animals and the ways in which animals experience the world, as well as trying to think, like you've touched on here, kind of the ethical relations of being with animals, we know, for example, that different animals have different kind of voice annotations. I think anyone who's had a dog or a cat in their home knows that individual's sound, and also kind of is aware of what different sounds mean. Like when Linus barks, I know a particular bark for help, and I know a particular bark when he's seen something outside that's irritated him. And I think what I'm sensing, and what I think is really important about your work here, is kind of asking these questions. They seem impossible to answer. How could we better understand how sound could help us to understand the worlds of animals? In the umwelt, and I think some of this kind of theoretical work has been done in some animal studies circles, and it would be really fascinating to kind of see these worlds come together, the technological realm that's gathering all of this data and is saying, yes, we're seeing these ecological differences. But yeah, there's something exciting there. I don't think I know enough about sound to really know what it is yet, but I just find that the animals are absent. And then you paint this picture of the nighthawks, and I could see it. I could imagine you guys walking through the sand, and I could see the labor of all of that. But what did you think about the kind of the ethics of doing that kind of research, of capturing an animal and of tying these devices to them? Do you think there are problems with doing that kind of work?
I think I do, and I think that the researchers did as well. I don't think any of them go forward doing this thinking that this is a really awesome thing that they're doing for them, because an animal in distress is obviously in distress, right? But it's a question of accessing the umwelt. Like with every new technological development, they try to minimize their interference with the ecosystem. And that's why, like with the ARU, that's why the ARU was so important for them, because it's minimal interference, right? Now, I don't know how they're going to, how they're going to pursue the questions that they have without interfering, in a sense. But like the very question of the very question of scientific abstraction is one whereby a human needs to interfere in order for it to be abstracted properly. I mean, but then there's the kind of problem you're unpacking there is not a problem of whether they're good, ethically good to the animals in that concrete experience, but it's an underlying question of the whole abstraction process that's involved in scientific research. right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And and they are aware of that, like they're, and it's interesting you mentioned Umwelt, because that term has crept into bioacoustics research, Umwelt, because of its overlapping interests with biosemiotics, right?
Hmm.
And so they're aware that these are worlds that that are limited. Like the original, what was it? The original example, the Umwelt, the most simple Umwelt, the world of the tick, right, is a very limited world that if you interfere, if you put the wrong elements into it, the Umwelt changes, right? So like when I think of Umwelt, I like the book, the What Would Animals Say If We Asked Them the Right Question? It's like, is knowledge of an animal's world, it should make it seem more alien and challenging than our previously held assumptions, rather than helping us feel that we're more approximate to the generalizable truth about an animal's species,
Hmm.
right? In the place that is kind of a repeated point of study, which is this little wildlife corridor in southern Alberta, just a couple hours north of the Montana border. The relationship with animals is, you know, well, it's one where the people there consider themselves living on the animal's land. Like living with animals means living on the animal's land. So, even though, one of the great pastimes is fishing, another pastime is hunting, and other pastimes are like, local agriculture and things like that. It's one it's an interesting world, and it just leads me to like one of my bioacoustics recordings that I have, which I'm actually I'm not allowed to share right now. Is my we had a long conversation about this particular recording with my ethics committee in at my university, and I was invited. Like we had neighbors up there when we lived there, who were having a pig slaughter party, and they had raised 4 pigs from piglets, and they were part of their family out in the yard. They built a pen for them, and my kids used to go and play with the pigs. And we had I got a call one time saying, "I'm wondering if you want to come and help us." The dad called me and asked if wondering if I wanted to come and help with the pigs because they're ready. And I said, "Well, what are they ready for?" And he said, "Well, they're ready to slaughter." And I asked if I could record it because I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see this happening, but it offered some interesting insights, especially into the question of, can an animal anticipate its own death? And what happened was, I don't want to go through the details of the recording, because my job in this situation was to hold back a pen hold the door on the pen of the other pigs as they were awaiting their execution. And when the first pig was out, and it happened, he used a 22 caliber shotgun to do this. The sound that the pig made was so distressing to me. It was distressing. It was a change in the composition of how I was embodying the situation, whereby at one point I knew that what I was doing was holding these other pigs back in their pen while wanting to let them go, mostly because of the kinds of the sounds and the movements of their bodies that they were making. So one let out this horrifying kind of squealing sound as it passed away. And while I was holding the door for the pen, the other pigs inside the pen went entirely silent, right? And as this one pig was fading out, the other 3 pigs started coming up with this vivacious sort of force and started slamming their bodies against the door. And it was a very grueling, real kind of moment. In the recording, as you hear a lot of like scuffling and sounds, and it's a lot of people sounds yelling instructions at each other, but it's these pigs that are over top of one another that are, in my only conclusion, is anticipating that something bad is happening to one of them, and thus that something bad will happen to all of them. And so something that I think I kind of learned from the bioacoustics researchers is that engaging with the sounds of the situation as the situation is happening, it's really important to kind of get into that moment, into it's hard to talk about that at that
Yeah.
time. but to kind of like to hear within that, like, well, like what is an umwelt? An umwelt in that case is not a world of the animal, where you isolate all the natural variables or all the variables of humans. In that case, like it's a sound of trying to flee, of trying to deterritorialize, of trying to leave the situation through the voice. And what the voice does is, and like animals do this, right? Animals' voices will make the animal seem larger than it is. Elk will do this. Like their voices sometimes are so massive, right, that it causes you to get out of their way. So again, the changes in the air pressure can cause bodies to move, like the starling murmurations.
Yeah.
And that comes up with the ethical part where I'm trying to hold the door back. And it was a very challenging, that was the most challenging bioacoustics recording that I'd done, was the pig slaughter.
I mean,
I'm still trying to write about it. I still start and then I can't proceed.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's and of course a difficult situation for the pigs, right? So they know what's coming,
Yes.
and I think even my heartbeat kind of increases there because I know that sound. I've watched enough videos to know that sound is a sound of terror, and I don't think I need to speak pig to know that kind of like I know that's fear. And of course there are a lot of psychologists and folks that might talk and say, well, what you think you know and what is, but yeah, I think as you kind of spoke to kind of their embodied reaction there, they're pushing against, kind of actively resisting what is happening, I think speaks to that. And then I think what you did there was really interesting is you've got this whole scenario, and thinking about it from a sound perspective now, you've got this whole scenario of these pigs and the squealing and the sounds they're making to push up against and to get out, and you're holding the door and there's people shouting instructions. If you were to remove those human sounds from that clip, it wouldn't make sense, right? It wouldn't. You would lose the structure and the context of what's actually compelling these pigs to slaughter. What's happening? If you were to be able to drop a microphone into a slaughterhouse, you would hear a lot of pigs and you'd hear a lot of clanking. But the second you try and isolate pigs from the sounds of the factory working, you lose the structure, you lose the thing that's going on. And I do wonder to some extent about what you were talking about earlier with regards to field researchers also walking and having to stand still so that they don't make the sounds of their jacket. There is a similar kind of a structural disavowal, I think, where if you no longer hear the jacket walking through what's supposedly pristine nature, then you also kind of lose sight of the fact that there are humans in Patagonia jackets. I don't want to slant Patagonia. I love Patagonia, but you brought them up earlier. But
they'll sponsor your research too. They'll give you free gear if you tell them that you use their gear when you do research.
Oh, there we go. Free gear. Now everybody knows, because these are animal studies people. But still, there's something to be said about also recording those sounds, and I wonder how something is fundamentally lost when you also remove those sounds in terms of understanding the actual structure of the world and the ways in which I think inequality and power dynamics shape these spaces and these experiences, not only for humans, but for the animals involved too. How does the sound of a parka jacket or of a gunshot influence them, and their reactions to that would sonically perhaps tell us a great deal about their worlds. I think it's fascinating.
I mean, you think during the anthropause, like last year, the anthropause, there was an explosion of sound research because they said, finally, we don't have the noise of humans so that we can access the deep sounds of nature, right? And the deep sounds of nature is only, we've only really, all the humans disappeared there for a little while. So we had this sort of utopia for the animals. But there's something important about the pigs I wanted to mention, actually, and that was I was trying to look up some of my original notes for the pig slaughter, and there's this, like the mechanistic way that we think of animals' voices in bioacoustics research as, as if the animal's body is this, convergence of different evolutionary forces that comes to a point where the animal's sound is this merging of different evolutionary paths. The argument for an animal is that it's in a constant state of presence, right? And so it can't anticipate in the way that a human can. You can't tell a dog to sit next Tuesday, right? Kind of thing, right? But this moment was the pigs anticipating something happening, but that wasn't what was strange to me. What was strange was that we have this sort of like this these conflicting points, right? One is that they're constantly present, but another is obviously they're anticipating something, which would say to me at that moment, at least with this small ethical farm, is that ethical farming can't exist in that situation, because it doesn't matter how many years that the animal was living gloriously on that farm. In that moment of anticipating its own violent death, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, I'm not sure. It's not important to come to the fact of that. But in that moment, I don't think it was thinking linearly if it has a constant presence. So if an animal has a constant presence and doesn't have that same kind of linear path that humans have in order to create self-consciousness, then that ethical farming doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they had, and this was a lot that led to my own brief flirtation with vegetarianism after that pig slaughter. But it was because it was sharing something at that moment. It's like it didn't matter that it was its life before that was a constant state of presence. Because if it's in a constant state of presence, its constant presence at that point was that it was certain that something bad was going to happen. Anyway, I think it only made sense at that point. It only made sense for the guilt of the farmer.
I think this is a really important conversation, and I hope for many folks listening or doing research with animals that I think it continues a flirtation with things like vegetarianism and veganism, because I think it's a hard conversation to have, especially and this is something that we haven't really brought up much in the show as a researcher. That's how do you navigate kind of these really difficult spaces, right? That are politically fraught, that you could get a lot of flack for speaking about in either direction. But at the same time, kind of living with integrity with your own ethical standpoints, and also taking into consideration the experiences of the animals involved. And I mean, at least for me, I know when it comes to, not to go too far off bioacoustics here, but when it comes to kind of the argument of, a good life is okay for a good death type thing, I'm not too sure I would accept that for any of my friends. If my friend Joe had a really good life, and he's had a good life, so let's kill him. The logic just doesn't sway there for me, I think. But maybe that's a conversation for another time. But thank you so much for.
It was a logical issue that came up, and that was like It was much more. It was a much more like a visceral kind of feeling than it was, reading about Glenn Gould's recording techniques.
That's important.
Introduced me.
Your body
really
reacts, right? Your heartbeat's going up. You're sad. You're thinking about it afterwards, and I think that sitting with those kinds of feelings is part of it, and the fact that sound can do that in a way. It does it differently when you're in the room, I think. So we've maybe become so desensitized. Speaking a bit back to what you were talking about earlier with regards to leaning into sound, leaning into getting things closer to our ears. In some regards, I think we've become so habituated to particular types of sounds, particular types of violences, but that there's something very different when you're standing in the room and you have that sound next to you and it's there. It's anyway. Thank you for sharing that, and I think these are really important conversations we have to have, because maybe this is a realm for bioacoustics. I think bioacoustics is being used by animal agriculture. I know that there are massive pig farms in China now that are using face recognition software, so as in pig facial recognition software, because they've figured out how to tell when the pigs are content or not, and they're using this to figure out a variety of things as to when to slaughter them and how. And in that is also some voice recognition software. So I don't know if that constitutes
fascinating
bioacoustics, but I think there is also an ethical thing to be thought of here in terms of how these technologies have lives, beyond conservation, beyond the, and that's not something in any individual researcher can necessarily be responsible for, but it's one of those thorny conversations, right?
It's fascinating. Nicely said. Thank you.
Sorry. I'm going on my own tangent there. Okay, so we're nearing the end now. So now's the opportunity to just kind of switch gears a little bit and listen to your quote. So do you have one ready?
I'm just going to find it here. It was by Jean-Luc Nancy. And I think it's one of these quotes that sort of stayed with me for some time. And the quote was by Jean-Luc Nancy from his little book called Listening from 2007. He writes, quote, "What is a being that gives itself over to listening, that is formed by listening or in listening, that is listening with all of its being?" That was my quote from his book on listening.
That's beautiful. And I think what I like about that is there is no kind of, the human is not necessarily centered there. They say being, right? So you could also imagine a dog listening, or a nighthawk listening, or a pig listening. You can imagine what it means for them to listen, maybe as well.
And it means, it's always it's something to come also back to R. Murray Schafer's observation about schizophrenia, which I don't know if it has so much to do with splitting sound from its source, but sort of splitting sound from the other senses, right? And the literature, like the post-humanist literature, or wherever these, the deconstructionists sit and where they're sitting today, listening is that sort of idea of straining towards an understanding. And if you take listening, like from, etymologically at least, it shares more in common with the idea of entendre, like in the French, which is to attend to, which isn't an audiocentric definition of listening, right? It's the ways in which different bodies come together in shared spaces and how they push each other out of those spaces or include one another in those spaces. So there's lots of different kinds of sense in that. There's sense as data, there's sense as world making, like with Umwelt, right? There's all kinds of different psychological stimuli that are connected through the amplitude of vibrations, and all kinds of senses, and more senses than sense. And so, like, part of my research program, and I'm sitting in the tail end of the first phase of a Canada research share right now, is to take the observations that I've learned about isolating sound and trying to use that again as a methodological area to understand how people, and animals and technology strain towards a mutual understanding of one another. And the straining towards understanding is always sort of like capturing a concrete experience, right? As opposed to an abstraction. Listening is also a practice. It's an ethical practice. What Jean-Luc Nancy is saying in his book, anyway, is that it's quite anti-philosophical, because listening isn't a rendering abstract of an object. Like, the more you look at an object, the more you understand what is beyond the qualities of the object and more towards its substance, right? Listening is a continuous concrete experience, right? You can't listen without a concrete experience. And the more that you listen, the more grounded you are, the more perspectival you are. And so I think it's like he's saying that listening is it's impossible to be philosophic when one is listening. So it's an odd philosophy that's non-philosophy, right? And I think this sort of like expanding empirical world of listening with and through animals is to understand that the animal is not making a sound and I am making a sound, as we're all sounding together, and we're sounding apart and we're sounding together, and much of the sound is just this continuous movement or this continuous flow. Like, there's a lot of the research being done right now is how sound connects us with this sort of Heraclitus kind of sense of flow, like the river is always changing, right? But that's sort of where I'm going with it. And that quote has always sort of stuck with me, of Jean-Luc Nancy, all throughout these different recording sounding processes.
It was poetic listening to you there. That was really quite beautiful. And I think you're right. There is an attentiveness to listening, because I think everyone's had a conversation with someone where they know that person's itching to speak next, and you can tell that they're not necessarily listening. And I think that maybe that's what it kind of means to not philosophize while listening. But then there's a moment for speaking as well. And how do listening and speaking coexist? I really love kind of what you're talking about, just sounding together, and also kind of the different experiences of sound. That sound is not just something through our ears. It's the vibrations we feel. It's how space moves between bodies. It's all of those wonderful things. And it's also smell and other senses too. So you said you're near the tail end of a Canada research chain now, and you're working on this project. Is there anything else that you're currently working on that you'd like listeners to be aware of?
Oh yeah. Well, and just to comment on that too, I think that's really nice. A mutual sleep deprivation makes for a mutual poetic, because you're probably just kind of, teetering on the horizon of sleep, which is where the poetry comes from, right? So maybe that's what does it too. But well, right now I'm trying to write this book. So I'm trying to look at the pig slaughter, and I'm trying to look at bear attacks, and I'm also looking at euthanasia, and the point, like there's a large amount of, I've been talking to people who work at veterinarian offices and things like that, and they say that there is an enormous amount of their clientele who do not stay for their pet's death, right? And so I'm trying to look at a way of capturing a bioacoustics recording of helping a pet pass on. That came with my experience of losing my dog this year, but it's the voice in that moment. It's a hard situation to be in, where you have your life, that, a companion that you lose, and then they go into an anonymous room and they don't know where they are, and their family's not around, and the sounds around them are just clanging and strange, like the people try to make it good for them, but what they need is their master's voice as they pass on, and maybe that brings us back to Little Nipper.
Yeah.
Like, that's one thing I'm looking at. So these different chapters I'm trying to write for this book that I've been trying to write for about 4 years. I've been trying to look at, these are very difficult situations to look at. So, you dive in a little bit, and I come out, and 2 months goes by. I'm like, okay, I think I'm ready to look at that again. And that's one thing I've been struggling to work with. I think that'll take another 5 years to write. But the other thing I'm looking at, but I do have to do a yearly report, so I have to have publications out there and stuff. But the second phase of the Canada Research Chair that I'm working on right now is moving into the area of solitude and voice composition. And so I'm trying to construct this sort of elaborate global composition of people's voices speaking about their experiences with solitude since COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And it's extending against visiting Glenn Gould's radio compositions. But I'm trying to create a web platform where you can type in search terms, and any number of voices come up that can be played simultaneously, which create this sort of vocal composition, which speaks more to the affective dimension and this sort of like creation of community around voices in solitude. And it's supposed to sort of update us on that stuff. And so it's going to touch on a lot of different things, like, COVID is one of those paradigm shifts, right? So the way that people related to their pets during COVID, this was a very good time for dogs, for for a lot of dogs. But people had more connections with their pets and their homes and things like that. So it's trying to get people's testimony about their experiences with solitude, and that's the big project that we're just sort of doing. We're starting our data collection now.
Interesting. It would be
with a research team.
Fascinating to have that database kind of right next to a database of all the sound recordings of animals recorded at the same time, and kind of how ideas of solitude and freedom, or solitude, and because those were kind of parallel narratives that happened at exactly the same time, kind of ideas of isolation, being caught up inside, while at the same time there were just stories proliferating about animals running through cities, of making noise in ways they'd never made noise before. And there's an interesting, like, who's in isolation when, right? Do other animals feel like they're in lockdown at every other time of year? Anyway, sorry, just riffing off you there. It's a fascinating.
It just opens to a new world. So that's the that's the next big project.
Brilliant. I love how you look at these really hard spaces and you think about them related to sound, because when you're in the thick of difficult situations, you don't think about how important sound is to you in that moment, how sensitive you are to it, how raw it can feel, and how important it can be when you feel hard. So thank you so much for these really great insights. If folks want to get in touch with you to learn more about your work or to connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
I didn't think of that. I'm on Twitter way too much, so I'll just get messages through there. I see who's following me and stuff. I don't have a big following or anything, but I just
You
that's
will
always
after
good.
this podcast
Email.
episode. But
Thank you.
um,
And then just email. You'll find my name. Mickey Vallee is it's pretty Googleable,
Okay.
and I'm all over the first page.
I'll make sure I include details in the show notes too. But I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for teaching us a bit more about bioacoustics and also kind of opening up our minds a bit to the value and the significance of sound and thinking about animals' lives.
Thank you. That was a tremendous conversation and a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Animal Highlights, everyone. So, Hannah, what are we talking about this time?
Today we're going to talk about the injury lemurs. I know, a bit random. We didn't talk about them in today's episode, but the last two episodes we talked about European and American species, so I thought it would be fun to go a little bit further afield. And I didn't know anything about lemurs beforehand, so I learned some fun things I'm going to share with you all today.
Well, I like, whenever I think of lemurs, I think of Madagascar, right? Of course,
Right.
I mean, maybe it's my generation, but I like to move it. That's literally what was his name? I forget. What was the name of the, was it Maurice? I think it was Maurice.
Maybe Maurice, yeah.
I
think so.
Move it. Yeah, that's literally, that's what I know about lemurs. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say.
Well, injury lemurs are a critically endangered species of lemur, which are found only in Madagascar. And Madagascar is home to huge numbers of endemic lemurs. And in fact, Madagascar is pretty much the only place that you might find a wild lemur, save for some tiny neighboring islands. So hence their foregrounding in the Madagascar film series. And the injury lemur is the largest of the lemurs. It's about 60 to 70 centimeters long, or about the size of a small child. They're a striking black and white. They have long arms and legs that you might expect from a lemur, and they almost seem to fly. They travel from tree to tree, and because they have these really long arms and legs, they can really propel themselves. And they look a bit like dogs or teddy bears, but they're actually primates and related to humans. So injury lemurs also have incredibly cool songs. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. They sound a bit like the shriek of a balloon quickly releasing air. Others say it sounds like the cross between a humpback whale and a crying baby.
Oh, goodness.
And while I was reading all these descriptions, I was thinking about something that you and Mickey talked about how before the advent of recording technologies, the ways in which people would describe birdsong. And I was thinking that, even though we can record them, that descriptive quality hasn't gone away. There are still times you have to describe an animal sound. But in these descriptions, they're kind of sounds like one, so like a humpback whale or like a crying baby, rather than phonetic. But here's my phonetic attempt to describe the injury song. It's it's an ooh-ah, ah-ooh. That's how I describe it.
Ooh-ah, ah-ooh.
Ooh-ah, ah-ooh. That doesn't do it justice. It's a lot more dramatic.
Okay.
I don't know if we're going to play the sound. If I play it from, can you hear that?
Huh.
So you can kind of get that like balloon escaping sound from that. Yeah.
Like when you hold the top of the balloon kind of open a little, right? And you like let the air out really slowly. Yeah, for sure. It's
and
interesting.
They have laryngeal air sacs, which make that sound. So I don't know that much about laryngeal air sacs, but I imagine the balloon sound kind of comes from that inflating and deflating.
Wow.
But yeah, very striking sounds. And what's interesting, especially about them, is they are the only kind of lemur that can sing. So yes, that's counted as a song. And what's funny about that is that every time you read about the Indri lemurs song, the word song is kind of in scare quotes, because people are kind of struggle to call that a song. But it is technically a song. Other lemurs do make sounds like barks and hisses, but only the Indri has a song. And they're actually one of the planet's loudest mammals. The sounds can be heard up to 1.2 miles away. They were described, so the song pattern of the Indri lemur was described by a bioacoustics researcher in 1986. And he said that each song is introduced by this communal roar of the Indri group for a few seconds, and then select adults will begin singing together in carefully synchronized manners. There are several functions to these songs, which include finding sexual partners and establishing territoriality and group identity. But how Indri lemurs came into my purview was a recent article in the New York Times, which described some research from researchers in Madagascar and the University of Turin, who actually found that lemurs have rhythm. So this is really cool.
Move it.
So the Madagascar film. What's the word I'm looking for? They envisioned that this would come. You know,
okay. They knew.
But this is actually the first time that a mammal other than humans have been found to have rhythm. So this is like a huge kind of discovery. So what the researchers did is they recorded sounds from about 30 animals for 12 years. So this is some bioacoustic research in the flesh. And they searched these songs for rhythmic features that are found in human music. So they found examples of the 1-1 rhythm and a 1-2 rhythm, which the lead researcher said are the same rhythms that can be found in the first verse of We Will Rock You, if that helps. Anyone think about that rhythm structure?
We will rock you. Rock you. Yeah. Okay.
So that would be the 1-2, I think. But yeah, so the researchers suggest that lemurs actually do have a sense of this beat. This isn't just us kind of searching for this rhythm in their structure. And they think that it might be like through learning more about this, they might find why humans are able to find rhythm as well. But yes, this is cool because musical cognition is one of those things that kind of feeds human exceptionalism. Like we think we're the only ones who can make music. But seeing how other mammals are capable of it too might kind of help us appreciate them a bit more. And I don't know, maybe restore some urgency to halting the Indri lemur's extinction, because it is quite urgent. The species is critically endangered due to agricultural habitat loss as well as illegal hunting. But yes, very cool, suave, singing, rhythmic lemurs for you today.
That's terribly sad, and it makes me think a little bit about in season 2 when we spoke about animal culture, right? Like music and dance, they're cultural elements. They're things that we attribute to culture. So these lemurs have a particular way of singing and dancing, which is really quite something. Thank you so much for teaching us a bit about lemurs, and I hope that everybody has I Like to Move It stuck in their heads right now. But that's it for this episode's Animal Highlight. Thank you so much. A huge thank you to Mickey Vallee for being a wonderful guest, to Hannah Hunter for doing the Animal Highlight, to Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music. Thank you as always to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E for sponsoring this podcast, and to the Sonic Art Studio and SAP Lab for sponsoring this season. You can also support the show, dear listener. If you want to, please leave a review. These reviews go a long way in terms of helping the podcast. And if you feel like giving a bit, you're also welcome to do that. You can find us on Patreon, on Buy Me a Coffee, and we have a tip jar on Good Pods. So there's many ways if you'd like to support the podcast. But there's no pressure to do that either. I'm just happy to have you here and listening with me. And for now, the season's going well, so yay! Anyway, time for me to say goodbye. I hope you enjoyed the show. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Herzenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.